I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. As always, I am Connor Ruebusch, joined, as always, by Dr. Patrick Wyman. Today we have a very interesting show for you because we're going to be talking about one of the least interesting fights in UFC history. UFC 209 was capped off by the rematch between Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson. And though a lot of people in the know were saying during all of the UFC's hyping of the first fight that, remember, it was a slow fight, but it had big moments, and so it felt tense, I think we knew to a certain extent that these guys could have a slow fight. I don't think anyone expected a fight that was twice as slow as the first one. Even the big moment in the fifth round from Tyron Woodley could not save this bout from really being quite dull. But our specialty on this show is taking things that seem dull and making them interesting. And whether that's arguing over Cesar Ferreira's questionable loss to Elias Theodorou, or talking about the intricacies of why Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson make for the most competitive staring match opponents in MMA history. That's what we like to do on this show. So we're going to kick things off by talking about Woodley-Thompson. Later on, we're going to get into some of our other favorite fights from UFC 209, including David Taymor's upset win over Lando Venata. We told you he was legit. And we're also going to get to Danny Garcia versus Keith Thurman in the second segment before finally previewing our favorite fights from next week's UFC card, which is actually a really solid fight night card headlined by Vitor Belfort versus Kelvin Gastelum, another middleweight bout for the former welterweight Gastelum. So without further ado, Tyron Woodley, Stephen Thompson, super slow fight, Pat. Incredibly slow.
Well, so we've now watched these guys fight for 50 minutes, and I think we can safely say that this is a bizarro version of some of the great extended matchups we've seen in MMA history. Edgar Maynard, Melendez Thompson, I think, is the classic one. Hendricks versus Robbie Lawler. Like, those are fantastic matchups where the two guys' styles play into each other in outstanding fashion. Even Miesha Tate versus Ronda Rousey as a duo of fights was like a fun matchup, even though Rousey won both of them. Like, they matched up well with each other. They brought out the best in each other. That's what you want in these kinds of fights. For a variety of stylistic reasons, Thompson and Woodley bring out the worst in each other. They are absolute kryptonite for putting on a fight that anybody could conceivably construe as slightly interesting.
Typically, when we talk about a perfect rivalry, both fighters are, in a way, kryptonite to each other, where, say, like, the one guy will love to come forward and throw, but the other guy's a great counterpuncher who can drop bombs on him. And so he will have his moments, but he will also have the other guy getting to do what he wants to do. This is a fight in which both guys are kryptonite in such a way that neither of them gets to do what they want to do, because the threat of what they could do seems to completely nullify both of them. It's very strange. I mean, we don't really have a lot of these pairings in MMA. It happens fairly often in boxing, where guys nullify each other, and maybe it will happen more in MMA as the sport evolves, but this is kind of the first rivalry I can think of where it does not result in a great back-and-forth series of fights. Instead, it results in an extremely slow and often very tedious affair.
Yeah, I mean, I think the second fight is actually more representative of the matchup as a whole than their first one was. Because the first one, I think we forget, and I had forgotten this until I rewatched it, just how bad most of the first fight was. Aside from Woodley's top control in the first round, and then Woodley's insane flurry in the fourth, and then a little bit when Thompson finally let his shots go in the fifth round. The first fight was, for most of its length, just atrocious. It was a bad fight.
It was basically at its dullest whenever Thompson was winning, because that was when Woodley wasn't doing anything. And then it was exciting when Woodley did something because the consequences were great. And then it was exciting after Woodley had done something in round 4 because we got to see Thompson come back and try to steal the fight. But most of the early portions of the bout were defined by not much happening. I mean, even Woodley's very smart takedown in the first round that surprised all of us was he was mostly inactive on the ground for about 2 minutes before landing some big dramatic looking shots in the last 30 seconds. So, not a lot happens between these guys. And why do you think that is? What's your read on it?
So honestly, I think it's more about Thompson than Woodley. And I know you may disagree with me a little bit on that, but really I think it's that Thompson's style depends on his opponent feeding him things, feeding him information about the timing, about the distance, about rhythm, and depends on his opponent doing things, giving Thompson things to key on, things to counter. I think more maybe than we had realized, Thompson's game depends on that constant influx of information and action for him to respond to.
By which you usually means people trying to get at him in some way.
Yeah, I think that's the basic thing, but I think that's usually how it expresses itself. But I think as a more general principle, it's true of his wrestling game and his counter wrestling game too. Like that is at a basic level, I think, what makes him go, and it makes sense because he's so experienced, right? Like he has all of this time, all of this experience to draw on that influences the way that he approaches the fight he's in at that given moment. Mm-hmm. It's all a process of accretion and building up. Yeah. Woodley, by his nature, does not give you things. That is the basic outline of his game, and Thompson could not overcome that. That was the basic underlying facet of this matchup, the thing that determined everything else, and Thompson could not find a way to overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say this: I tend to be pretty forgiving of what I see as stylistic limitations. So when I see somebody like we'll be talking about this later, Danny Garcia versus Keith Thurman. When I see Danny Garcia not doing as well when he has to come forward because he's kind of slow on his feet and doesn't cut off the ring that well, to me, that's because that's not his style. That's not what he's really best at. And so I can look at that and be like, yeah, I wish he'd done something different, but, I understand. But what I will say is that maybe it's kind of a good separator between greatness or real potential for greatness and just very goodness. Because I think that kind of adaptability, being able to fight against type and being able to, consciously execute a game plan that maybe isn't the thing you're most comfortable with is a good sign for how well a fighter can, how much longevity they can have. They're the type of fighter then that could be a champion and stay a champion for a long time. And I'm not sure that Stephen Thompson has that. But that being said, I'm not sure Woodley really has it either. I'm not sure that Woodley is. I mean, when's the last time Woodley has adapted? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So let me come back to that real quick. I think the reason that it irks me so that Thompson's performance here irked me so much more than Woodley's is I really subscribe to the be the champ, you got to beat the champ realm of thinking about things. That I think if you're the champion, you are incentivized to maintain your title at all costs. That's just the financial structure of this sport, is you make so much more as a champion than you do otherwise. It does not matter so much how you win fights, though that is important. Your baseline thing always has to be maintain the belt. That's it. Like, all other incentives that you could possibly have are drastically undervalued next to that, because you have to stay the champion. You're going to make 5-10 times as much having that belt. So I don't blame Woodley for fighting in a style that is going to give him the best chance of doing that. Thompson, it was clear what he needed to do. The game plan was out there. If Jake Shields could do it, if Rory McDonald could do it, then all Thompson needed to do was look at that film and say, you know what, I know this may not be my the approach I'm most comfortable with, but like you said, he needed to fight against type a little bit and let himself go and maybe accrue a little bit more risk than he's normally comfortable with in order to give himself the best chance of winning the fight. In neither of these two fights did I ever think Thompson is really doing what he has to do to win this. Like, I don't know what he was missing out on. I don't know if it was fear of the power, if it was fear of the takedown. But those are things you can game plan around. There are ways to deal with those, and he just didn't do it. Like that, that really bothers me. Yeah,
so what it looked like to me is, because I mentioned this last week, and I think it's a smart decision as a part of a larger game plan. It looked to me like Thompson was interested mostly in trying to play the role of the aggressive counterpuncher. Because just as in the last fight, he spent a lot of time with Woodley backed into the fence, typical Woodley fight, and wasn't comfortable leading because he did not want to, Thompson's mostly setting up that right hand, setting up the right kick, he's like a finesse version of Woodley in that way, except that he actually uses his other limbs to disguise it. But Thompson likes to throw that right hand and fall into it, and he's open to be countered when he does that. And so I think he knew that. The last fight, I think the first time he got hit and really hurt by the right hand was a counter, like a cross counter to his left straight when he was fighting in southpaw. And so I think he wanted to draw Woodley out and make Woodley lead, because Woodley, too, overextends and throws himself into his shots. And then he would do the things he does very well, take angles, quick short back steps, those hop step counters, lots of great little subtle things that he can do that we saw, say, in the Johnny Hendricks fight when someone is charging after him. But Woodley wouldn't charge. And I see what you're saying, that I think Thompson should have come in with something better to get Woodley to charge, whether it means... he did a lot of feinting, but you have to do more than feinting. You got to have some kind of safe weapon that you can make the person uncomfortable with, make them jumpy so they can't time their charges that well. And if it shuts them down and they don't get anything done, perfect. You are scoring. But what happens most of the times, especially when someone knows they need to keep their belt, is they feel you scoring and touching away, and then they need to do something to get it back. And those would be the opportunities that Thompson needed. And what happened instead was that he kind of just got in front of Woodley and feinted, but did so little actual throwing that none of those feints really threatened Woodley, and none of them prompted him to do anything. So it ended up being a very much a stalemate.
Yeah, I have to say, this is the worst fight I've ever seen live.
You lost out on Khabib versus Ferguson, and then you got this.
Yep.
You are a tragic figure. That much can be said.
I can't be too sad, because I was at UFC 199, which was just awesome.
Amazing, yeah.
In every possible way. So I'm not going to I'm not going to complain about that too much. And as a live viewer, I have to say, it was even worse than it would have been on TV, just because it was so interminable. Friend of the show at Susie Kuzi on Twitter, Suzanne Davis, Journalist of the Year, Suzanne Davis,
of course.
Susie Kuzi went through and counted and paid attention and counted the gaps between anything happening. 1 minute and 44 seconds in the first round, 1 minute and 8 seconds in the second round, gaps between either fighter throwing a strike. That is just awful. That is comically bad. You could not draw up a fight that uneventful if you were trying to. That's insane, man.
So do you think that this is just the way Woodley's going to approach every fight? Because you as champion, you pointed out earlier that on his way to the title, he was a lot more willing to be aggressive. But now he has to hurt someone before he'll get aggressive. The thing is that Woodley can fight aggressive really well. When he had Thompson hurt and was pressuring him, he was throwing out this sort of, kind of reminded me of 52 blocks, the little circling with his left arm, suggesting a hook so that Thompson didn't want to go to his left, and he was loading up the right. His pressure footwork was nice. He closed the distance well. He can do it. But I think a big part of what Woodley does is, and I've a friend of his confirmed this for me, that he thinks it's the case too, that he's spoken to Tyron about it, and this is what he's gathered. Tyron was really concerned with gassing. And we talked about that last week, that gassing is a problem for a guy like Woodley, or is a potential problem, and because Woodley is so deliberately inactive and patient, it becomes not a problem. But I kind of get the feeling that it's a bigger problem in Woodley's head than it is in reality. Woodley could do a little more to actually set up those shots, but I'm now wondering if he's going to completely shy away from being active in any way as champion, just to sort of preserve that excellent puncher's chance that he always has for 25 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's the real question. How is Woodley going to approach everything from here on out? I think if you watch that Shields fight, he was plenty active in that fight. He was throwing a lot of strikes. I think he landed 60-something strikes against Jake Shields, which for Woodley is an incredible pace. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's way more than
he was active as hell in the Gastelum fight compared to this one. I really enjoyed the Gastelum fight.
Up until he broke his foot, yeah.
Yeah, but I enjoyed that fight. I could see what Woodley was trying to do. He was still Tyron Woodley, but he was looking for his counters. And he was setting them up, and he was moving laterally, and he was making Gastelum walk into things. And as much as, yes, I think some of the onus is on Stephen Thompson, he did not really do that to Stephen Thompson. He didn't seem to be actively setting things up for long portions of this fight.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe a 60-40 thing.
Sure.
Where I think Thompson deserves the majority of it simply because the game plan was there for him. He knew what he needed to do. Whereas I think Thompson is a much more puzzling stylistic challenge. And frankly, I think for Woodley, Thompson is a much more difficult raw matchup because he has great takedown defense, because he can push a great pace, because he is so dangerous when you try to pressure him, because there's a huge height and reach disadvantage for Woodley there.
Yeah.
I think it was a much tougher fight for Woodley, but Woodley found ways to stymie Thompson in ways that Thompson never found ways to stymie Woodley.
Right.
You know?
Like the fact that maybe the best thing for Tyron Woodley against Stephen Thompson is to make Stephen Thompson inactive and just make him not dangerous and make it so that stamina is not an issue and just extend the opportunities he has to end the fight or steal a big moment. And he did that. So you could argue that it was actually the best, because I think Thompson is a harder stylistic matchup for Woodley than Woodley is for Thompson. I think there are more things that Thompson could do to make Woodley's life hell. But for Woodley, like, his two options are basically don't throw much and back up, or don't throw much but come forward and threaten to throw. And that's really dangerous against Stephen Thompson.
This was there was a good reason why Woodley was a betting underdog to Thompson both times, and why for their first fight, basically everybody picked Thompson.
Yeah.
Going into that. And it wasn't just because Thompson had been on a great run, it was because the thought was that this was a really tough stylistic matchup for Woodley. So I don't know that this is how Woodley is going to approach everybody. I think if you put Woodley in there with GSP, I think that's a much more active Woodley, because I don't think he has as much he would have as much reason to be afraid as he came forward. I don't think he would need to feel so afraid of gassing out in that fight if it were a quick paced one. I think that he would have a much better he would believe more in his punch, I think, in that fight, because GSP is more hurtable at this point in his career than Stephen Thompson is. Thompson, for all of the flaws that we talked about, is a remarkably tough guy and always has been.
He had to get hit in the back of the head about 3 times before he actually got hurt in this fight.
Yeah, I mean, he's not some soft point karate dude. This is a tough, durable, generally kind of mean kickboxer when he really gets into it, you know? So I think that's just a way tougher matchup. Maia too. I think Woodley would approach Maia more cautiously at first, but I think he would genuinely turn it up once you got past round 3.
Yeah. But speaking of people who nullify each other, Tyron Woodley, basically impossible to take down. Damian Maia desperately needs the takedown. I don't know what to expect. The fact that Woodley can knock Maia's block off in an instant probably changes it, but I don't know. I can also see that being a stinker.
If I have to choose between kinds of inactive fights, I would rather have an inactive fight where the guys are trying to shove each other against the fence than an inactive fight where they're just staring at each other across 6 feet of open space.
True. Yeah, I agree.
That's, not like you want either of those things, but if you had to put them in some kind of hierarchy, I would take a grinding attritional clinch war over staring contest.
Yeah, I'm with you. At least attrition means that something is actually being done. To the other fighter.
Well, even if it's only just copious amounts of sweat dripping off those guys.
Yeah. Well, enough. I think enough words spared for Woodley Thompson too. An interesting fight in its way, but not interesting to watch, really. And that's just the nature of the game sometimes. The one fight that was very interesting, even though people complained that it, unfairly they complained that it could never replace Nurmagomedov Ferguson, which, nothing can. But David Tamor versus Lando Venata, lightweight co-main event, was a banger. Totally the opposite of Woodley Thompson. Both guys had tools to hurt the other, and both were constantly trying to find ways around the other's offense while keeping their own offense going. So
this was a case of a fantastic stylistic match.
I hope these guys have a rivalry. I hope they fight again in the future when both guys are more established in the division, because they match up very well.
Yeah, this was a kind of, I don't know that we had realized before this fight that maybe we should be classifying Venata as a pressure fighter, but I think he is very straightforwardly a pressure fighter, and Tamor is very straightforwardly an out fighter, right? So this is a classic stylistic matchup of the pressure fighter versus the out fighter. And I think Tamor is just a little bit better from a fundamental perspective at being an outfighter than Venata is at being a pressure fighter.
Mm-hmm.
That to me was kind of the story of the fight, that Tamor did a fantastic job of setting his distance. He was always all the way out or all the way in. He did a great job of not just utilizing the clinch to slow Venata down in the pocket, but hurting Venata when he got him there. He did a great job of setting long range. Like when Venata was trying to gauge distance with those front leg kicks, he was either eating counters or Tamor did a good job of counter kicking those too, to take away that distance. He took away the spinning strikes. Like, I thought it was a really fantastic performance from Tamor. And Venata, I think he made some puzzling decisions that don't necessarily speak well of him right now, but think that they're things that he can work out in the future.
Well, one thing that I noticed, I do want to point out too, Tamor did one of my favorite Muay Thai tricks consistently in this fight, where Venata would be coming forward and he would threaten him with the knee, and then when Venata stepped away, he turned the knee into a kick. He did it like 5 times in this fight, and I love seeing it. You never see that in MMA, when somebody throws the knee and then just extends the leg and it becomes a chambered kick. I love it. It's very tricky.
He's a great kicker, man.
Yeah,
really,
he's
like a really strong fundamental kicker. We talked about that last week.
Yeah, he's excellent. Venata, one thing that did trouble me a bit is last week, I think I touched on the fact that Venata tends to watch his work a little bit. And I think maybe even more than that is that he's really trying really hard to no-sell things. That's the impression I got in this fight. Like, there were 2 sequences in round 2 in which Tamor threw a left hand, got a clinch off of it, like an inside, sort of a collar and elbow clinch, and hit Venata with 3 horrible knees to the body, just vicious left knees to the body. Venata does nothing but absorb them, and then Tamor separates and cracks him with a right hook, while Venata is still just standing straight up and looking at him. And I'm not sure why that is. Like, I think Venata's trying... It works in a way, because Joe Rogan calling the fight is like, oh, these vicious knees, but he's like, Venata takes them well, though. Even though that shouldn't really matter that much, because he's taking vicious knees. But I wonder if maybe Venata spends a little too much of his time and thought thinking of how to mentally beat the other guy, how to make the other guy think he's not hurting him, when I don't think that really works on a guy like Tamor, who is just a textbook fighter, who just keeps plugging away, you know? Did you pick up on that at all?
Tamor is a really sound process fighter.
Yes.
You know, like this was not just a matchup of a pressure fighter versus an outfighter. It was a matchup of a really strongly defined process fighter versus a really strongly defined dynamic fighter, I think. And that doesn't mean that Venata can't do the process thing and can't win rounds, but I think he's very strongly built, and I know this from talking to him too, from having interviewed him, like, he wants to finish guys. Yeah. And he wants to do so in entertaining fashion. Like, he is, I think, deep down an entertainer, and he's groovy, he's flashy. Like, that's how he rolls. Tamor has a deep kickboxing background, and he knows that, sometimes you just got to go out there and you got to take rounds. That doesn't mean those rounds can't be exciting. That doesn't mean you can't finish your opponent. Obviously, he finished his first 2 UFC opponents, but he had won those rounds too.
Oh yeah, yeah. Like, It speaks to me of Venata's inexperience more than anything, I think, is that he does a good job of it, I think. He does look very impressive, which is why most people don't talk about the fact that he was getting nothing done before he knocked John McDessie out, and was, in fact, arguably losing the round up to that point. Nobody talks about it, because he looks like he's trying. He looks cool and flashy. He's bouncing on his toes. He's trying all these good-looking strikes, and of course he wins the fight in spectacular fashion. But in this case, I think it speaks to his experience, because it just wasn't the time or the place for that level of bullshitting. When Tamor's output was very consistent, and Tamor's style, I do want to talk a little more before we wrap this segment about his outfighting techniques, but Tamor was just very consistent, and Venata could not convince him to change up in any way by, kind of showboating and trying to get in his head, which is what I thought he did a lot of in this fight, was really trying to sort of scare Tamor, and it didn't seem to work. Yeah,
well, and Venata has tricks, it's not just, and not just of the flashy kind either. Like, he does a really good job of doing something boxers do really well, that we don't see a whole lot of in MMA, using one hand outstretched to measure distance and then firing your power hand behind that. Mm-hmm. Like, you blind with your lead hand and then throw the power hand.
Technically illegal. One of my favorite boxing techniques.
Yeah, but it's something we see a lot of from boxers who like to operate in the pocket.
Terrence Crawford does it a lot. If anybody wants to see it done well.
Yeah, Crawford, I think, is a master of that particular technique. Floyd Mayweather has traditionally done that pretty dang well too.
Yeah.
Adrian Broner, in his better moments, has used it effectively, but that's Adrian Broner.
Tommy Hearns, Lennox Lewis, if we're talking old school fighters. Yeah, it's a good technique. You post with your hand, you push against their face and cover their eyes, and then you let the right hand go just before you start to retract the left. And Venata does it well. And he also does a good job of throwing that lead right and covering a lot of distance with it, but then having a backup defensive plan after it connects or it misses. Like he does a good job of layering defensive movements after every attack.
Yeah, I don't think he's a natural defensive fighter.
Yes.
I think he's kind of an organic offensive fighter and a rote defensive fighter.
I was just going to say
at this point.
I agree.
Which I think speaks to what Brandon Gibson has done with him as a trainer, because I think left to his own devices, Venata would have very little defense at all.
He would be a tiny Justin Gaethje.
yeah, more or less. And so I think you can see, we know that defense takes longer than offense in MMA. Yeah. We know this, right? We've talked about this many times over the course of this show, that every great defensive MMA fighter is a veteran. There are almost no up-and-coming fighters who are really sound defensively. It's just a hard skill set to gain in MMA because there are so many different challenges that you have to deal with and adjust to. So the fact that Venata has any defense at all at this point in his career is better than not. But it's limited. It's kind of limited.
Yeah. The things I wanted to say about Tamor's outfighting. Obviously, he did a great job navigating the ring. His footwork was really nice and concise. He rarely even let Venata get so close that he had to pivot. But when Venata did get in and pressure really hard in a straight line, Tamor had some pivots. He really showed the efficacy of a good, well-rounded defensive footwork system. But the one thing that really stood out to me, first of all, Joe Rogan, I love him. He was so shocked that David Tamor was shooting for takedowns, which just once again convinces me that he does not study fighters' footage if he's not calling their fights, because Tamor did that in his last fight. He did it against Jason Novelli. He shot for a takedown when Novelli started to pressure him. And he's from All Stars. That's what they do. That's what Gustafsson does. You know what I mean? Gustafsson's always the guy you're like, wow, a striker taking down Daniel Cormier. So Tamor has that. But I think he used it so well because I remember how much flack I got when I suggested that Holly Holm should maybe try to shoot on Ronda Rousey and then just disengage if she couldn't get it. And the reason I suggested it back then is because I'm always noticing how often good outfighters in boxing close the distance, because it's not all the way out all the time. It's all the way out or all the way in. That is the rule book for the effective outfighter, for the boxer. And you need to be able to get all the way in, because no fighter, no matter how skilled, is going to be able to constantly keep 3 feet of space between themselves and a skilled pressure fighter.
Yeah, we've seen the limitations of that in MMA with somebody we'll talk about a little later in the show, Edson Barboza.
Yes.
Because Barboza has traditionally been an all the way out guy, period. No all the way out or all the way in. He's getting better at it now.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be an effective outfighter, you need to have 2 ranges on the feet where you're effective. It can either be, obviously it's going to be all the way out is going to be your preference, but you either need to be able to exchange in the pocket or you need to be able to clinch at will. One of those two. Barboza has kind of gone in the direction of exchanging in the pocket, but I think clinching is probably the more usual one, right?
Yeah, Barboza's gone more in the boxer puncher direction, like I'll scare you off if you get in close. And Tamor can do that a little bit too, but mostly he's closing the distance. And he's got a great tie clinch, but the difference between boxing and MMA is that strikers, usually the people who want to stay away are strikers from striking backgrounds, and they don't want to wrestle. And so it makes it tough for them, because stepping into the clinch usually means engaging with the more determined grappler. But if you can shoot and take their hips away from them and then just be ready to disengage, which is what Tamor did. He pretty much never finished a takedown, but he got in very well on about at least 6. And it allowed him to control the distance in different ways. And it also, I mean, it's a classic MMA move that we used to always think of it as something you would do when you're being aggressive and setting up shots. Like Kevin Randleman shoots and then uses the level change to knock out Mirko Krokop with a left hook when he's ready to sprawl. But it works really well when you're fighting defensively too, because when you plant your feet, if the other guy doesn't know if you're going to step in with a left straight or go for a takedown or pivot away and then hit him with punches as he adjusts and tries to reface you, that gives you options. It gives you switch ups. And Tamor, I thought, did a fantastic job of keeping his options open. Vannata, who wanted to keep getting after him and push the pace and break him, could never tell what the next thing he was going to run into was going to be. And credit to Vannata for not really, he didn't back down. It didn't scare him. He kept trying. But Tamor, I think that even makes Tamor's effectiveness even more impressive, because he had a guy who would not be, his mind would not be changed. He didn't consent to an outside fight as a result of Tamor's takedown attempts and counter left hands and pivots and combinations. He kept coming, and Tamor still managed to keep him guessing enough that he could sting Vannata or get him on his butt for a second and make him hesitate just enough that he could then reestablish and do it all over again.
Yeah, I think Vannata could have done more with his level changes and takedown attempts of his own. Like, I think that would have been a really effective tool for him. But I thought, I mean, just in general, like we've been a little critical of Vannata here. We've mostly, I think, been singing Tamor's praises, but Vannata is still a really good fighter, and he's still a really good prospect. And he happened to, at an early point in his career, run into a really hard stylistic matchup and still got into a great banger of a fight, won himself a performance bonus, and he's going to be back, you know, especially if he gets into a fight with, like, I think if you put in Vannata with somebody like Ross Pearson, he's going to knock his block off. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that would be a great fight. I mean, that's why I try to put it to Lando's inexperience, and not anything else. Like, he knows what to do, but just doesn't have it down to the point where he doesn't have to think about it just yet.
Yeah, and that's, I think, is going to be a major theme when we come back in the next segment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tamor Vannata, fantastic fight, great stuff. When we get back, we're going to talk about which ones did we decide on? We're going to talk about, well, got to give a shout out to Dad Bod Dan Kelly, and talk momentarily about Overeem Hunt, and then, of course, Mirsad Bektic will be the focus of our UFC 209 recap, as well as Luke Sanders, who suffered a similar comeback defeat from his equally experienced and crafty opponent. And then after that, Danny Garcia, Keith Thurman, and much more. Stay tuned.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's start things off by saying that Dad Bod Dan Kelly is a true middleweight champion of the world, and no one can deny that any longer. 4 wins in a row, 39 years old. Just bow down and kiss the ring already. And how much more is there to say about this fight other than just Dan Kelly's the best?
Kelly's walkout was, honest to God, one of my favorite parts of UFC 209, just because he literally looked like an aging dad on his way to bat in a beer league softball game. Like, that was how he walked to the cage. He was like, God damn it, my knees hurt. Oh, my back. I'm so tired. Little Jimmy's got a project due this week. Christ, I got to pull an extra shift. Like, all right, let me just hit the goddamn ball.
I love it.
That was all I could think of as he was walking to the cage. But Dan Kelly, honest to God, he's a really good fighter.
Yeah,
like
he's a natural
in basically every way.
He's a natural. I mean, there's something to be said for that. Maybe judo does actually prepare people to transition to striking quite well in a lot of ways because of the hand fight. I mean, you do have to be, unlike in wrestling, you retreat a little more, you angle a little more, and you do have to be conscious of your range because you do a lot more reaching out. You don't need to get in close to tie up with somebody like you do in wrestling. You can grab their sleeve as they reach their hand out. So it's very much like hand fighting for boxing. And so Kelly seems to get that. The head movement part he hasn't really gotten yet. But when it comes to hand fighting and timing his shots, he's a natural. He's not. He does not look like someone who has only been grappling since he was 7 years old, and didn't really do MMA in earnest until 2012. He looks like a guy who's like a solid regional MMA veteran. And so I think that's actually pretty damn impressive. And yeah, I don't know.
His footwork is just awesome. You note how he always had outside foot position on Evans the whole fight.
His pressuring footwork is really nice, but that's what I think. I think some of that has to come down to what he did in judo for so long. Like, I think that stuff is very easy for him to learn. And fuck all these young fighters doing yoga and shit, because anybody who says you need to be flexible to fight has never seen Dad Bod Dan Kelly.
That's true. That is absolutely true.
He's the stiffest old man in the sport.
Shouts to Phil McKenzie, friend of the show, Phil McKenzie, who pointed out to both of us on Twitter that the third round was probably Rashad's best all-around striking performance in his career.
Yeah, I don't think that's he had to say in parentheses being serious, but I think he was right. Like, Rashad actually looked pretty good. He showed up. He looked like an older Rashad, but he didn't look bad. He had a lot of moments and was very competitive. And I think really that what we take away from this performance is that if Rashad enjoys competing still, you know, if he's in that Anderson Silva phase of his career, then why not encourage him to keep going as long as he wants? And that we should really take away is not that Rashad is done because this is like the lowest ranked opponent he's lost to, but that Dan Kelly is actually really quite good. Yeah,
Kelly had a perfect game plan for dealing with him.
Yeah, because he had to weather some shit early in the fight too.
Mm-hmm. There was nothing wrong. Like, this was not a bad Rashad. This was not like, I thought looking at the Teixeira fight and maybe a little bit the Bader fight, you could have looked at those and thought, man, is Rashad kind of done? Like, is he just is he through? Because it looked like he was having trouble pulling the trigger. He did not look like he was having trouble pulling the trigger in this fight.
I think it may be. I may recognize a little of myself in what was going on with Rashad, but I think it may have just been the size of those dudes compared to him. Because Rashad was never a huge light heavyweight, and it's, for me, it's a lot harder for me to think like, you know what I mean? I do a lot more closing my eyes and shit when somebody has a foot of height on me than when I'm fighting someone my height or smaller. And I think Rashad seemed to be experiencing that with two giants like Bader and Teixeira, particularly Bader, because he didn't really have a chance to show anything against Teixeira, but Bader shut him down just by getting after him. And I think it's a lot harder for him at this point to fight people like John Jones and Bader and somebody like Dan Kelly, who's his size. I think it was more like fighting Chuck Liddell. Like, he's still dangerous, but like, he's my size. I can deal with him.
Now, speaking of something you just mentioned, how much fun would Rashad versus Anderson Silva be?
As
kind of like, as long as you kept your expectations appropriate, right? Like, it would probably be a pretty slow paced fight, but it would be fun. That would be a fun as hell fight.
Yeah, like Silva Diaz, you know, that, like, it doesn't have to be a barn burner. It's an interesting fight at this stage in their careers. I am down for that. I think that sounds great.
That is a fight that I would love to watch.
It's basically the next best thing to Anderson Silva versus GSP, which the UFC has foolishly not given us.
Hey, UFC, give us the money because that's your co-main for the GSP Bisping card.
Yeah.
And that way, if either Bisping or GSP has to pull out, you make Rashad Bisping 2 or make Bisping Silva 2. Yeah. And either way, you've got a great headliner.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great to me. We will take a 1% pay-per-view buy bonus over 200,000 buys. So that's all.
Yeah, just a little one, something for our trouble, you know.
Did we even talk about the fact that the GSP Bisping is happening on this show?
I don't know if we come back to that at some later date. I don't want to.
I just thought people were like on Reddit. They were like, "Oh, that feeling when you record an episode just before GSP Bisping is announced because we didn't address it." And I was like, "Yeah, like I'm desperate to talk about that fucking fight." I would have loved to spend a whole segment talking about it if only we'd known.
I was real mad right when they announced it, and I'm still kind of mad, mostly because I think it's kind of a waste of both guys promotionally, not so much for the fight in the cage. Like, leaving that aside, we will find interesting things to talk about in that matchup. Yeah. I'm not concerned about that. I just think they could be doing better things with both guys that would maximize what they can do with them. And there are questions about where it leads. Anyway, I'm writing a thing on that this week. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, we'll see. Overeem Hunt. Mark Hunt.
I think Hunt's done, man. That's all I could take from that. He had a couple of moments, but he looked like he was having so much trouble pulling the trigger. Even when the opportunities were there, when Overeem was shelled up, he could have gone around, under, through the guard. He had his openings, and he couldn't do it. Like, when you can't pull the trigger anymore physically, that's it. You're done.
I think it's stamina. Like, I really think Hunt, he's sucking wind after the first 3 power punches he throws, and he really has to only pick the best pot, because even he had Overeem up against the fence, and he was like trying so hard to pick his shots and lace them around Overeem's guard, and did a pretty good job. But just it would have been better to just bomb him with 6 uppercuts in a row. And I'm not sure that Mark Hunt can do that anymore. I mean, I don't think he's done, and I think he still wants to fight. I think Mark Hunt just likes it. And I'm not super worried about his chin. Like, he's been knocked cold before. Yes, he's easier to knock out now than he was before. But honestly, that's probably better for a dude late in his career to get knocked out, rather than just take 6,000 blows to the head and not go away.
Oh, like the Stipe fight?
Right. Yeah. I prefer him to fight dudes that can knock him out, and rather than dudes that can just pummel him to pieces like Stipe did.
I'm not even sure Hunt wants to fight anymore. Like, that, he talked about that in the lead up to this fight. He's like, yeah, I don't really want to be here. I don't really want to do this.
He said afterwards he went to the doctor and he was like, he was like, I'll be back, and I'm looking forward to getting back in there and stuff like that. So who knows? If he doesn't want to, then yeah, he shouldn't feel compelled to. I hope his book does well.
It's hard to say with Hunt, though. Like, yeah. I think there is a tendency to read kind of a narrative into the things that Hunt says and does, more so than the kind of disparate quality of those things would make safe. Like, he says a lot of shit, Mark Hunt.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
He doesn't say a lot of shit. he says
the things that he says veer in different directions, and always have. And like trying to draw a best fit line of what does Mark Hunt think is tough.
Yeah. I think it looked to me like a Mark Hunt who could go in there and have a fight with, I don't know.
Shamil Abdurrahimov.
Sure. Like somebody else who's not super active. He can steal moments against. Or, guys like when he fought Frank Mir and he fought Bigfoot again. Not that I want to see those dudes get knocked out anymore either, but somebody who's not just... Because the thing with Overeem is, he still had his moments where his confidence started to buckle, and a younger Hunt, like even just 2 years younger Hunt, would have knocked him out the way we expected. But Overeem still is in very good condition. He is still a phenomenal athlete. Both has great explosiveness and speed, but also has a very good stamina. With his new style, like Overeem has always had pretty good stamina. It's just that he's blown it. You know what I mean? He's always blown it instantly trying to finish people. When he doesn't do that, he can go. He can go for 3 rounds. He didn't really seem to have much of a problem here. Whereas Mark Hunt was doing about half as much work as Overeem and was just puffing and huffing and puffing the whole time. So that's tough for Mark Hunt. I thought Overeem, he looked like late career Overeem. Still enjoyed it. Don't like when he turns his back. Don't like when the commentators defend it. Because Joe Rogan, I feel like I'm ripping on Joe Rogan a lot this episode. Sorry, Joe, but Joe Rogan kept saying like, the fans don't like that. They're booing when Overeem turns his back, but it's a legitimate tactic. I'm like, no, it's the wrong way to move. You face your opponent when you move away. It's called footwork. I will never support when somebody turns their back and runs away unless they are limp-legging out of a takedown attempt. It's the only time you're allowed to turn your back and I'll forgive you. So, I don't know. I don't like it. I think it's a bad move every single time. And if it wasn't an old Mark Hunt who wasn't willing to throw, he would have caught him with a left hook on the way out and hurt him. But
Yeah, but enough about these two two elderly fights. Let's talk about some young guys. Let's talk about Mirsad Bektic versus Darren Elkins and Yuri Alcantara versus Luke Sanders.
2 similar turnarounds in these fights. 2 older crafty veterans against 2 young and promising up-and-comers. And in both fights, the young and promising up-and-comers looked really good. I mean, really, really good early. And what do you think went wrong for... Let's start with Bektic. What do you think went wrong for him, if anything?
Well, I think what went wrong for them was the same thing. It was inexperience and its close cousin, fight IQ. In different ways for each fighter. Like, Sanders just kind of lost concentration for a moment. Yeah. He was in a position that he thought he'd been dominating from early in the fight, and I'm sure he knows that you can hit a leg lock from there. I'm sure he is aware of that, but he thought he was dominating. At various points, that fight was close to being stopped. I thought it should have been stopped watching live. I'm less sure of that on the rewatch.
I felt that way too live. I felt like in the first round it could have been stopped even.
Oh, everybody around me in the stands was screaming to stop the fight. Like, there were people who were turning away because they didn't want to watch it anymore.
Nurmagomedov Johnson-esque, where there were a lot of moments where it was right on that line. You're like, I know he's not being knocked out, but he can't get away from this.
Yeah, like when Sanders had him pinned against the fence, that was the big one.
Yeah.
And was just unloading shot after shot.
Pressing weight down in his back and just smashing him with the right hand to the side of the head. And Alcantara couldn't do anything.
I mean, and I still think it should have been stopped. Like, I just tend toward that side. Like, I very rarely think, like, oh, yeah, that stoppage was too early. But Sanders, I think, thought he had the fight in the bag and just for a moment lost focus. That's really common for talented prospects. It's enough that we've talked about it several times, the prospect submission loss.
He was even, I think, to your point, he was even a step behind in the whole escape process. It wasn't just that he didn't see the submission coming. It took a while to get locked on fully. I watched the fights with our mutual friend TP Grant, formerly of Bloody Elbow. I'm not sure if he writes there anymore, but he was pointing out how, like the way to get out of that knee bar is to try and turn fully and angle your knee the wrong direction so they can't get the leverage with their hips. And he kind of half-heartedly did it and didn't really seem to commit to one direction. And in doing it only halfway, I think he actually gave Alcantara the space he needed to lever his lower leg out and fully get the knee bar in. Alcantara did a good job. He triangled the legs. I think he made it difficult for him to turn because of it. But even so, Sanders was it was clear that he thought something like that wouldn't happen. He was a step behind the moment the knee bar came on and never caught up as Alcantara was adjusting to finish it.
Well, and I think he was tired too, right? Like,
sure,
I think that played into it, that not just physically, but mentally tired.
Yeah.
When you give a guy everything you have and he's still there and all of a sudden he grabs your leg, you're like, okay, let me give me a second to kind of collect myself here. And this is a really common thing that you see a lot with prospects. Like, it happened to GSP against Matt Hughes. It happened to Jose Aldo against Luciano Azevedo. It happened twice to Conor McGregor. It happened to our current favorite prospect, Tom Duquesnoy, against Makwan Amirkhani when he was a young up-and-comer. And all of these losses share things in common. The guys are big, they're experienced, they're durable. It's usually not right away. The McGregor losses are a little different because those were pretty much right away. But usually it's after the prospect has been dominating for a little while, like it gets a little bit overconfident. Like, there is a distinct pattern to these losses. It happens.
And maybe for McGregor, it's because overconfident is the way he starts fights, not something he becomes over the course of the fight.
That's true. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so he just throws himself right into the prospect loss.
Yeah. So Bektic's was a little bit different, I think, but it was also a result of fight IQ and inexperience.
And I think Bektic, too, by the way, was quite tired at the time that Elkins caught him.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that went wrong here. But, the result was that he got tired, and that's why he lost the fight. But the mistake actually started in the second round. If you go back and you rewatch the second round, he starts to wrestle against the fence with Elkins instead of hitting his takedowns in open space or hitting his level change in open space and then driving Elkins to the fence to finish. He starts chaining against the fence, and he lets Elkins defend, and Elkins lands some shots, and then they get back to open space, and Elkins lands some more shots, and eventually Bektic gets his takedown, and he does good work from the top, but he had to work to do it. And that was the moment where I'm like, that's probably not good. He's getting sucked into Elkins' fight. And that pattern just continued in the third round.
Yeah, it was also the first round in which Elkins started to steal opportunities. He started to gamble on a few submissions. He went for an arm in guillotine. He went for, I think, a Mars or an Anaconda at one point, and fell to his back to finish that, and got a couple of reversals. I think that's a very good point. We were actually talking, watching the fight live, about how smart it was in the first round that Bektic was refusing to take Elkins down against the fence. Because while that is a position where Bektic is very effective when you're grounded, we've seen him maul a lot of people while pinning them against the fence. It's probably the last place you want to be with a super experienced cage wrestler like Darren Elkins. You don't want to give him that chance to wall walk and reverse and control you, because he's very good at it. And yeah, I think you're maybe spot on that his idea was just that he could take the fight anywhere and win. And I don't blame him for that, by the way, because again, this fight could have been stopped in the first round. Elkins' face does not look like Darren Elkins' face anymore.
It was a really specific kind of mistake, right? I've heard people there were people who tweeted us after the fight asking, why did he keep wrestling with him? Why did he keep grappling with him? And my answer to that is because he's a better wrestler. He's a better grappler.
He's just chose the wrong specific location.
And that's why fight IQ matters, because you have to be experienced enough and smart enough to know that even if you're the better striker or the better wrestler or the better grappler, there are specific places where you want to be doing that and specific places where you don't.
Sure.
And it takes practice to learn how that applies and how that applies. It takes practice to know what the limitations of your gas tank are. That I think if Bektic has like a kind of a built-in weakness, it's his aggression and his willingness to go full bore all the time.
And
normally,
though I don't want to Oh, sorry, please go on.
Well, normally that's not going to be a problem because either he's such a powerhouse that he's going to finish a guy, or his opponent is not going to be a guy with an endless gas tank who can just keep fighting and keep fighting and keep fighting, right? But in this case, there were specific places where he shouldn't have been wrestling and grappling with Elkins. There were times when he should have known that he needed to pull back and rest a little bit and get his wind back. And so it was those two things. But those are the kinds of things that you learn as a young fighter.
Yeah.
These are not crippling problems with his game. It's just like you live and you learn.
Yeah, it doesn't ruin my hope for Bektic. I mean, he looked fantastic in this fight, even when he was scrambling against the fence. It was just a fight in which Bektic against someone else other than Darren Elkins would have been fine. Bektic could have been fighting Nick Lentz, who I made the mistake of equating with Elkins, except for the fact that he can't match Elkins' pace. And that would have been the saving factor. He could have done all the same things, survived the scrambles, because he didn't get caught in any submissions that he couldn't get out of. He could have done that and still won the fight. The fact that Elkins does not slow down and does not stop pushing his same exact high pace is a problem. I was going to say that maybe a thing to keep in mind going forward as a limitation of Bektic's. Do you think there's anything to the idea that maybe his chin is not the best? I don't want to overstate it and say that he has a bad chin, but we've now seen a couple times where he's gotten pretty badly shaken by not necessarily the cleanest, hardest shots in the world.
Maybe, but I'm not inclined to go that way until we really see it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And
I have an inkling.
It always worries me a little bit when you see a young fighter who gets stung by shots like that, especially because we know how hard Bektic has been on his body.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you ask people about Bektic, what they tell you is that he trains super hard. He's a beast in the gym. Like I asked Jason High about this a couple of years ago, and then again when I saw him recently. Like the consensus is just Bektic outworks everybody. He's always in there. He always wants to do more and more and more. And I think that can take the form, especially at a camp like ATT where you're surrounded by other good fighters, of being in sparring sessions all the time and probably taking too many shots in sparring sessions.
He needs to hook up with Dominic Cruz, who had to get injured a million times before he learned the art of just not fighting so hard.
Yeah, exactly. And Bektic doesn't, and you can see how that plays out in Bektic's game. Like it's part of what makes him such a great fighter. And this is kind of always going to be the paradox of how you train in MMA, but it may take a toll on him in the long run. It may burn him out faster, how hard he works to get himself to that spot. So I think a qualified, maybe we should start to wonder, but I'm not there yet.
If he ever decides to go train with some other camps, let's hope it's like it's Alliance or Jackson Wink or like Mark Henry and not AKA. Let's just say that. Because I'm not sure that Bektic at this point needs people who are willing to push him as hard as he wants to be pushed. I think you may be onto something there. And I think you're onto something with the way the fight went. I think they're wrestling against the cage. That's a good eye. I think that's spot on. So let's actually wrap this segment. And when we come back, we're going to give our thoughts on Danny Garcia versus Keith Thurman and then quickly run through our picks for favorite fights on next week's UFC card. We will do that after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And we are back. So before we get into UFC Fight Night, what are they calling this one? UFC Fight Night 106, a.k.a. UFC Fight Night Belfort versus Gastelum, a.k.a. UFC Fight Night Fortaleza. So UFC really nailing down that naming convention with how their cards are referred to. Before we get to that, and of course the main event between Vitor Belfort and Kelvin Gastelum, which is a fight that both Pat and I love, we're going to try and quickly give our thoughts on an excellent boxing match that happened this weekend between Danny Garcia and Keith Thurman. And while it didn't necessarily play out as a war, I thought it was a good fight. What really makes me say that it was excellent is that this has been a great year for boxing so far. It's been a great 5 months, because boxing sucked in 2016. I mean, we can be straight up about that. Yes,
God awful.
There were
Kovalev Ward was the only high point, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there were some really good fights. There was Salido Vargas. There were some good high points, some good fights, but they were so
the rise of Lomachenko.
Sure, right. Yeah, there were definitely highlights, but they were few and far between, and we just didn't see enough of the very best fighters in the world fighting each other. And this fight was a perfect example of that. And we have gotten that now multiple times in the last few months between really great fighters. We had Lomachenko Walters, we had Ward Kovalev, and now Garcia Thurman. And I'm especially thankful for that because Danny Garcia does not exactly have a reputation as a guy who is willing to fight the toughest contenders in his divisions. So I was glad that he took this fight on. It ended up being a tough stylistic matchup for him, I think. Though it could have gone either way, because Keith Thurman, to my mind, is a quintessential boxer-puncher in that there is literally no perfect marriage between those two styles. Because essentially what a boxer-puncher is a puncher and a boxer, is somebody who will brawl and somebody who will box. And Keith Thurman doesn't seem to have committed fully to one enough that I feel like I can trust him. He didn't, they read the numbers for Keith Thurman's fight with Sean Porter. You know how many jabs he threw against Sean Porter?
How many?
Over 12 rounds? 11. He threw 11 jabs over 12 rounds.
Well, so the commentators were talking about that.
Yes.
That his jab just sometimes goes MIA.
Yes.
But then sometimes, like in this fight, I thought he did a great job with this jab.
Yeah, he has flashes of serious boxing brilliance. He can do it. He moves his feet really well. He's got a great jab.
I love the guard he uses with his. I love the way he keeps his right hand out to catch jabs and counter off of them.
Yeah.
There's so much depth of craft to his game when he lets himself be crafty. That was the thing that really stood out to me here was how versatile he was and how comfortable he looked doing switching between modes. It was seamless how he went from aggressive punching to boxing on the outside to standing his ground to exchange in the pocket. I thought his shot selection was fantastic. I thought he did a great job of reading Garcia and responding to what he gave him. Mm-hmm. This was the most impressed I've ever been with Thurman, because it always, to me, I get what you're saying. It always seems like there's a bit of a disconnect between the physical ability and the mindset that he takes going into a fight. I don't know. It's kind of weird. He never quite seems like he's living up to it. In this fight, I thought he lived up to it.
Yeah. All that, to my mind, all that Keith Thurman lacks is discipline. And this was a nice fight where he had at least a little more discipline, because If we had seen the Keith Thurman who was willing to engage with the guy coming after him the way he did against Sean Porter, this probably would have been the banger that people were expecting. It almost was. The first 2 rounds, a lot of punches being traded. I was sitting in my computer chair yelping and squealing and covering my face and putting my hand up to my mouth like the audience at an Eddie Murphy show. Everything was just absolutely crazy. And then it simmered down. And I think it was absolutely brilliant for Keith Thurman to make it simmer down, because Danny Garcia is a limited fighter. I have a lot of respect for Danny Garcia because I think he has done a ton with not as much as other fighters in his division, at his echelon, have. When you're talking about athleticism, speed, explosiveness, stamina, Garcia can't match Keith Thurman. Not at all. But you give him someone who will come after him and stand in the pocket, and he is sharp. It was just this weekend that I realized how similar Danny Garcia is to Canelo Alvarez. Kind of slow on his feet, can't really pressure all that well, but you let him defend and cut angles, tight pivots where he doesn't have to move his feet a lot, he looks really good. And there were moments where Keith Thurman fell into that, but then he settled on making Danny Garcia chase him, and it made it way easier for him to take rounds without really having to do all that much.
Yeah, I thought Garcia did about as well as he could have done in this matchup. Like, did it really seem to you like Garcia left anything on the table? Like there were strategies out there that he could have employed or tactics that he could have employed? I think he kind of just ran into the wall of what his physical ability will allow him to do against the very top tier.
I think he should have been body punching a lot more. I mean, I think he should have done... It would have maybe made the scores a little dicey, but let's face it, they were dicey anyway because there's no way Danny Garcia won 7 rounds and one judge thought he did. He should have done what Canelo Alvarez did. Schwan Humes brought this up on Twitter, our buddy at Black Jordan Breen. He said that he should have done what Canelo did against Erislandy Lara, and should have just exclusively hunted the body. Jabs to the body, right hand, left hook to the body, uppercuts to the body in the pocket, so you get this little slim chance that Thurman, who likes to bend over really deep, might duck into one and hurt himself. But I think he needed to neutralize Thurman and bring him down to his level, where he was fighting at a slower pace. And I think Thurman, when he gets tired, is more willing to stand his ground and trade, and that would have favored Garcia, or at least made it a 50-50 fight, rather than the 70-30 fight it ended up being. But otherwise, I mean, yeah, Garcia looked okay. It's a kind of fight he can't fight that well. And I don't know how you can make Keith Thurman come after you if he has clearly committed himself to making you chase him. So, yeah, I thought both guys showed up. I'm glad that it happened more than anything. I'm just glad that there are boxing fights between the best fighters in the world.
I'm with that.
Let's see. There's not much more to say. I'm excited. I know most of our listeners are MMA fans, and don't worry, we'll be talking about MMA in a moment, but boxing has been good for the last couple months, and that makes me happy because there's so much craft and beauty in boxing that you can't get in MMA. The specificity of skill, it just makes it so wonderful. So I'm happy to see it at the highest level being executed the way it should. Let's see. UFC Fight Night Fortaleza, Vitor Belfort versus Kelvin Gastelum. What do you make of it, Pat?
Tough stylistic matchup for Vitor. Pressure has been his kryptonite over the last few years, even more so than it has been throughout most of his career. Guys who have gotten in his face have been the ones who have given him the most trouble, and Gastelum might be the most defined pressure fighter, except for maybe Jacare, of everybody that he's fought recently.
And definitely a different kind of pressure fighter than Jacare.
Yeah, he is really, really high volume. So yeah. I think the combination of the volume and the pressure is going to be tough for a Belfort who doesn't necessarily look bad. He had his moments against Mousasi. I was kind of shocked at how decent he looked for long stretches of that fight.
He looks fine.
He can still crack. He can crack hard for sure. I'm picking Gastelum, but Gastelum is there to be hit. Gastelum is hittable. And Vitor, if he lands clean, can probably still separate him from his consciousness. If Gastelum weren't quite as tough, it might be a little harder pick, but Gastelum is just rawhide. And I don't know what you need to do to hurt that dude.
There is something to be said for the fact that, once again, Kelvin Gastelum, as a small middleweight, will be taking on one of the larger dudes in the division. Vitor is no longer TRT Tour, so he's not as big as he once was, but he's still a pretty big middleweight and still pretty thickly muscled and very powerful. So to me, one of Gastelum's big advantages, aside from his volume, could be the fact that he can take Vitor down and make him scramble and hit him while he scrambles, or hold him on his back and beat him up. Vitor has often been susceptible to good wrestlers, and I'm not sure that that'll be as easy as it would be if Vitor was another welterweight-sized guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's an interesting matchup. It's a fight I'm really stoked about because I think there are questions that are going to need to be answered about both guys. I think this is fairly obviously Vitor's last fight. I kind of doubt that he's going to keep fighting after this. He said that he was retiring after the last one. It's just the fact that this is in his hometown that made him decide to take it. I think it will be interesting for us to talk a little bit about Vitor's career in the broad scheme of things because he spans so many different eras.
Yeah, maybe next week we can try and do a little bit of a retrospective on Vitor as a sort of in memoriam after Kelvin Gastelum most likely flattens him.
Yeah. Well, how high do you think Gastelum can go in the middleweight division as a 5'9" dude, even if he is pretty thickly muscled?
Pretty high. There are guys who are going to trouble him, like Kelvin Gastelum, I think, would have a hard time with Luke Rockhold, even though I think he's well suited to give a guy like Rockhold trouble with that level of layered pressure that he can put on. He really seemed to struggle mentally with the size disparity, just the length and height when he fought Neil Magny. It really kind of shut his game down in a way that most fighters can't. So I think there are people there who will hurt him, but he's also a very strong and thick dude, and he closes the distance really well. And it may actually make it harder to hit him for some of these taller guys. That it may actually sort of equal out the fact that he doesn't move his head all that much on the way in because he's shorter, so he's not going to be as easy for them to get a beat on his head position. So he's got some advantages as a little dude. And I will always maintain that being short is not the worst thing for fighting. There are some specific things you can do as a short guy that give tall guys a lot of trouble. So I have high hopes. I think I like Gastelum as a middleweight. I like people who don't cut weight and just get to go in there and pour all of their energy out in every round and feel fine and probably take shots a little better too. So I'm on board with Gastelum as a middleweight.
I'm a little wary about the Magny thing because that was his first fight with Cordero. And so I think there was an adjustment period.
Sure. Yeah.
In terms of getting used to that style of coaching and making it work. It's not like a positive data point if you're thinking about Gastelum eventually fighting bigger fighters, but I think it's hard to tell how much to read into that. We'll know more here shortly.
It's like my comments on Bektic's chin. Like, I don't want to overstate and say Gastelum can't deal with tall dudes because you're right, it was a camp change and it's just one piece of data. Maybe it was just an off night for him too. But it's something that I will have in my mind if it reappears. And I will say, now I can confirm that it is a legit problem. If it happens again. If Kelvin Gastelum fights Luke Rockhold next and cannot deal with the fact that he's big and tall, then that will confirm it for me.
The fact that Gastelum is a pretty active and willing kicker kind of makes up for it to some extent.
Like Cormier against Jones. Just be willing to chop their legs.
Yeah, and he is very willing, and he's trained by a guy who like preaches at the altar of the body kick.
Yes.
So, so that kind of minimizes it. But,
speaking of whom,
but yeah, still an issue.
Speaking of whom, Beneil Dariush, another Rafael Cordero student, taking on Edson Barboza in a lightweight fight on this card. A fantastic matchup. I would kind of like to see Barboza thrust into the bigger picture, but maybe Beneil Dariush is actually right there on the cusp of top 5 fighters as well. And so this is kind of a sorting out fight. From my perspective,
that's exactly what it is. You've got all these dudes who are sitting outside the lightweight elite right now, and you've got to kind of figure out where they stand and who actually deserves a shot against one of the top fighters in this division. Like we don't know what the hell is happening at lightweight, and you need to have. There's so much talent. You need to
clear the logjam.
Yeah, basically, like because you have a whole bunch of dudes who are ranked between 5 and 15 who could conceivably make a run, but they've all also kind of been around for a while. So who can string together 3 or 4 good wins, I guess.
Now I'm imagining loggers separating 2 logs from the rest in a river and making them fight to see which one gets to go downstream. And clearing the logjam is a metaphor that does not hold together for very long, is my point. Dariush Barboza. I think it's a great fight. I mean, Dariush, we know, is a very solid striker for a guy who is billed as a grappling specialist. With Cordero, I think he is, like a lot of Cordero fighters, he's solid more almost because of, I mean, I don't want to say he's not technically proficient. He obviously is. But the mentality he has with his striking is a very key part of it. And that makes him an interesting foil for Barboza, who is extremely technically proficient, but has historically been a little shakier on the confidence side. So they're kind of like they each fill out the category in which the other guy's a little weaker.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting facet here. This is a very clear pressure fighter versus out fighter matchup, and it's one where Dariush's confidence, is kind of
his confidence makes up for his lesser technique. Barboza's technique makes up for his lesser confidence.
Yeah, and so you've kind of, and I mean the athleticism gap is also pretty substantial here, right? Like Barboza is just way faster, way faster than Dariush is. Barboza is a fairly sizable favorite right now. I think he's edging close to -200, and that surprised that's a little bit surprising to me, because we know Barboza has a good stick and move game, but we also know Dariush is just going to stick on him. Like, Dariush is not going to let him get away. Dariush also has kind of surprising power in his hands. We learned that recently. He's a good fundamental puncher. He's got a great sense for when and how to throw his shots. Like, he's a smart fighter who adjusts really well. He's also a southpaw, and we haven't. When was the last time we saw Barboza against a southpaw?
That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, Barboza against southpaw kind of terrifies me because I'm thinking of his right kick to the body.
It was Michael Johnson.
Oh, sure, yeah. Who he was okay against. You know, Johnson put a ton of pressure on. I'm not sure that Dariush can even match the pace that Johnson tried to apply in that fight.
Yeah. God. So
Evan Dunham?
I guess Evan Dunham.
Ooh, body kick knockout.
Yeah.
Called for it. Yeah, it'll be an interesting test. I think I would not be at all surprised if Benny Dariush gets to him over the course of the fight. But Dariush is also not the most durable dude in the world.
Yeah.
And so it's not like he can do a Tony Ferguson and walk through everything Barboza throws. We have to give Barboza credit for his accuracy, his footwork. I mean, he is a master of positioning and always getting himself into the position to land some really beautiful shots, both with his hands and his feet.
And one of the ways that opponents got around that early in his career, because even then he was not especially easy to pressure, was by exploiting his tendency to stop and watch his work, and he doesn't do that anymore at all.
Yeah, he's fixed it, and he doesn't try to scare people off as much anymore. He's more of a frustrator than a scarer. He doesn't plant his feet and trade to try and convince them not to chase him anymore, which used to get him in trouble. Now he does a lot more of shots that are in ones and twos only, and then he's moving, he angles, and he'll hit you again if you chase him immediately with a jab to get you to back off, and then you'll chase him and he can rinse and repeat. So he's a much more proficient outfighter than he was before. Both guys with kind of shaky chins, one more confident, but I think Barboza's getting there. He's certainly not as shaky in that front as he once was. So I do favor Barboza, but I would not be surprised if Dariush really comes in and decides to push the pace, he could get to him later in the fight.
Yeah, I'm seeing kind of a 29-28 decision for Barboza here. That to me seems like the most likely outcome. I could see a wide range here. I think there's a lot of different things that could happen. It's a great matchup. It is a great fight.
I agree.
And then was there anything else on this card that we wanted to talk about real quick, or was that it?
There are. I mean, it's a good card, but unfortunately, I think we're probably at our time limit for this week. So we will have to invest in not only celebrating the career of Vitor Belfort, but recapping some of these other bouts. I will say, if you guys are looking for which bouts you should be interested in, that maybe you want to watch some footage, I would say Jussier Formiga versus Ray Borg is a solid fight. Of course, I have a soft spot for Bethe Correia, although no one else seems to enjoy her fights. But Francisco Trinaldo, Kevin Lee is a fight that I also like quite a lot. And if you're looking for a fun grappling match between a veteran and a veteran-esque younger guy, I would say Hani Yahya versus Joe Soto should be a fun fight as well. So it's a solid card. It's a very well-rounded. We were saying earlier, off the air, I think, but we should say on the air, Shelby and Maynard, I think, are doing a fantastic job of making undercards so far in 2017.
Yeah, I think you can argue about the broad context of like the main events and what the strategies are for putting them together. But the undercard, UFC 208 accepted, and I think that was kind of a freakish confluence of circumstances. Every undercard in the Shelby Maynard era has been fun. Basically every fight serves a purpose, a clear purpose. We know what it is, and they tend to be ones that bring out the best in both fighters.
What is Maynard's first name?
Mick.
We have Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard. He used to run
Legacy Fighting Championship. He was the owner.
Yeah,
of
I know that. I thought it was Mick in my head, and then I thought I was tricking myself because now we have two matchmakers with alliterative names, Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard. I was like, my brain just made that up. Yeah, well, they've been doing a great job. The main events have been, I will agree, a bit lackluster for the big cards. And I think that maybe is where WME, I get the sense, is maybe meddling more and having more influence, and they don't necessarily understand what makes sense. But when you let the professional matchmakers control it, this is all guesswork, speculation. But my feeling is that in the undercards these days, I am always seeing very clear intent with every matchup. Like, this is a sorting out fight. Here we get a prospect tested against a veteran. Here we get a prospect fighting a washed up veteran. Everything is building or testing or putting on a fun fight, and everything is interesting in some way. for somebody like me who watches a lot of fights. I can appreciate all of it for the most part. So I'm happy with it. And thank you, Mick and Sean, for doing us a good turn in that regard. And thank you to everyone at home for listening to this episode. Before we wrap up, Pat, what do you have coming out this week?
Not a whole lot.
You say that every time. You say not a whole lot, and then you have like 3 or 4 things.
Okay, well, last week I didn't, because I did have a lot coming out last week.
Yeah, that's
last
true.
week was super freaking busy.
So you just say not a whole lot, and it's more than me, or you say a whole lot, and it's twice as much as me.
No, this week is fairly slow. So I have a new Fall of Rome episode out on communications and mobility. That came out last week. The post is up on Deadspin right now if you want to check it out and hang in the comments. Let's see, what else am I doing? I am doing a complete guide to this weekend's fight card. I think that's it. All that I'm doing for Bleacher Report, though. I wrote a technical recap of UFC 209 if you want to check that out. I'm doing another piece for Deadspin talking about GSP Bisping, kind of the broad context of GSP Bisping and what it means at this point. And I'll have a new episode of History Matters with Keith, with my co-host Keith, talking about globalization, old and new. But that's about it. That's not that much, man. That's like a normal work week.
Yeah, I suppose.
A light week.
You've gone to like slightly over full time from extremely prolific. So
yeah, this is like 45 or 50 hours rather than 65 or 70, I think. Sure.
I guess that's fair. I guess. Let's see. Boy, I spend all my time now just thinking about trying to keep up with Pat that I have no idea what I'm even doing. I'm going to be doing a technique recap of UFC 209. I really want to talk about fights like Tamor Venata, and I'm going to find some interesting way to write about Woodley Thompson. Although if I'm smart, I will make that the last part of the article so people don't feel compelled to read through it. Because most people, when I said on Twitter, hey, I have to rewatch this fight so I can score it, because I was drinking lots of bourbon while it was happening and didn't score it accurately, people said, Mookie Alexander, for example, said, hey, make sure to cut out some time to not rewatch it. Because nobody really cares at this point. Everyone's over it. They're sick of it. But I will find some interesting angle for that. And then Sherdog preview for the upcoming Gastelum Belfort card and something else. I don't know. Something else other than that. Oh, I'm going to write about Garcia Thurman for Bloody Elbow and for Bad Left Hook. So keep an eye out for that as well, you boxing fans. And if you're one of our many MMA fan-based listeners and you want to get more into boxing, now is a perfect time to try to dip your toes in that water. And I encourage you to read pieces like that, not just because I wrote them and because I want people to read them, but because if you found the kind of stuff that Pat and I do to make MMA more enjoyable, then hopefully we can do that for you for boxing as well. Because I know both of us have a passion for boxing that we don't often get to indulge on this show. And it's a good time to be a boxing fan, especially compared to last year. So thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you listening to the show, and especially we appreciate you patrons. We will have another bonus episode coming out next week. And we are now getting people into that private Slack chat. I had some good fight discussion happening during UFC 209. If you are a $1 patron or up, send an email to boxingbush, B-U-S-C-H, @gmail.com. From the email you would like associated with the account with your preferred username, and you will receive an email and get to set your password, and you can go in there and discuss with, I believe, over 180 other Heavy Hands patrons and talk on fight nights and chat with us occasionally and, just be an active community and get to share your passion for martial arts with us and with other fans. So thank you everybody for supporting us. Find us on social media, Boxing Bush, B-U-S-C-H, @Patrick_Wyman. And until next time, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.